Some people think secrets protect love. They don't. The steam was already thick. Soren Devereaux stood at the edge of the East Corridor at 5:47 in the morning, holding a leather therapy binder against his chest, and not moving. Not yet. Because if he moved, if he took one more step toward that closed door at the far end of the hall, he would have to admit that he could feel Khyven Rourke's presence through it. Not here. Feel. The scent came first. Cedar and something warmer underneath. A trace of the body wash Khyven had used for as long as Soren had known him, unchanged across 5 years, across silence, across whatever name you want to give what had happened between them. The shower ran at the same time every morning. 5:45. Never 5:43. Never 5:50. The kind of habit that tells you more about a person than any conversation ever could. Khyven Rourke ran on precision. He always had. Soren hadn't meant to be in this corridor. His guest suite was on the opposite wing of the estate, which was the arrangement Marceline, Khyven's estate coordinator, had specifically set up, probably on direct instruction. But little Ezra had woken up screaming again at 4:30. Room 114. The boy's nightmares were getting worse, not better, which was exactly why Soren was here in the first place. Not as anything personal. As a contracted trauma consultant. That was the title on the paperwork. That was the only thing Soren had agreed to when the call came through 3 weeks ago. He told himself it meant nothing. He was starting to understand that was a lie. Hi viewers. Have you ever walked back into a place that once broke you and realized the hardest part wasn't the memories? It was realizing you still knew exactly where everything was? Drop a yes or a no in the comments right now, I want to know. Soren exhaled through his nose and turned back toward room 114. Ezra was sitting up in the bed when Soren returned, his small dark hands folded in his lap, his eyes too calm for a child who had just been screaming. He was 8 years old. He had not spoken a single word since the explosion 4 years ago. Not one. The doctors had cleared his vocal cords 6 months after the incident. The silence was a choice his nervous system had made on his behalf, and no one had been able to reach the part of him that made that call. No one except, apparently, Soren. Soren set the binder down on the nightstand and sat in the chair beside the bed. He signed slowly, careful, unhurried, the way he always opened their sessions. Good morning, Ezra. The boy looked at him for a long moment. Then he raised both hands and signed back. Not the words they'd been practicing. Something else entirely. Something that made Soren's chest go completely still. He knows you're here, Ezra signed. He stood outside the door last night. He didn't knock. Soren didn't respond immediately. He kept his face even neutral, the way his training had taught him to do when a patient said something that landed harder than expected. He nodded once, slowly. Then he asked the only question that mattered. How did that make you feel? Ezra tilted his head. Thought about it the way only a child can, with no performance, no filter. Then he signed 3 words that Soren was absolutely not prepared for. Like he's scared. Khyven Rourke. Scared. The man who had run a mafia syndicate by the age of 28. The man whose silence in a boardroom had once made 6 grown men stand up and leave without a word being exchanged. The man who had looked at Soren across 5 years of distance and done absolutely nothing about it. Because Khyven Rourke did not do things he could not control. Scared. Soren stared at Ezra for a beat too long. The boy was still watching him. Patient. Certain. And then Soren realized something that cut through everything. Ezra had never signed that word before. Not once. In all of their sessions, in all of the careful, slow, trust-building work, Ezra had never named another person's emotion unprompted. Until now. About Khyven. Soren closed his binder, set it on the nightstand, looked at this child who had survived something neither of them talked about yet, and understood in the quiet of that room, at 5:51 in the morning, that whatever he had been telling himself about why he came back was already coming undone. Some truths don't wait for you to be ready. They just walk into the room. Down the hall, the shower shut off. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Stopping right outside room 114. No knock. The meeting should have been over by 8. It wasn't. 5 years ago. Third floor conference suite. The Rourke Estates private syndicate hall. A room that looked like a law firm and functioned like a war room. Soren Devereaux had stood against the far wall the entire session. Hands folded, mouth closed, doing exactly what he had been brought there to do. Smell. That sounds crass when you say it out loud. But in syndicate politics, it was one of the few things you couldn't fake. An omega with Soren's classification. What the inner circles called a scent verification omega, could walk into a room and know within minutes who was afraid, who was lying, and who was carrying something they shouldn't be. Not perfect. Not a party trick. But accurate enough that Khyven Rourke had kept Soren on retainer for nearly 2 years before that night. Strictly professional. That was what Khyven had called it. That was what Soren had told himself. There were 6 men at the table that evening. 4 were syndicate seniors from the Rourke Coalition. 2 were guests, liaisons from a southeastern network testing the edges of a partnership deal. Soren had been watching them since they walked in. The one on the left, Dexton Briard, had a particular smell underneath his cologne. Sharp. Chemical. Wrong. It didn't register immediately. These things rarely do. Khyven sat at the head of the table, speaking in that low, controlled voice he used when he was managing people. Not commanding them, but arranging them the way you arrange furniture in a room you already own. He wore a black fitted shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, one hand resting on the table with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was contained. There was a difference, and Soren knew it by now. Khyven Rourke was never fully at rest. Even when he looked it. The drinks came out at 7:40. That's when Soren's chest tightened. Not anxiety. Recognition. The scent that had been hovering underneath Dexton Briard's jacket. It was in the room now. Dispersed. Faint enough that no one else would catch it. But Soren's classification didn't work like a nose. It worked like a tuning fork. And everything in him was vibrating. He crossed the room in 4 steps. Didn't say a word. Put one hand flat on the table in front of Khyven, which was the code. The only code they had agreed on. Stop everything. Khyven looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then Khyven stood. The interruption caused confusion, which was intentional. By the time Dexton Briard understood what was happening, the glass Khyven had been about to lift was already gone from the table. By the time 2 of Khyven's men moved toward the doors, the room had changed temperature entirely. Soren didn't watch any of that. He was already pulling Khyven down the corridor by the wrist. The guest bathroom. Steam, because the pipes in this wing always ran hot without being asked. Soren turned the shower on full, shoved Khyven toward it fully clothed, and stood in the entrance blocking the door because his body had made that decision before his mind caught up to it. The toxin was contact-based. He'd smelled it before. Once. In a case study he wasn't supposed to have access to. Steam neutralized it. That was the theory. He was running on theory. Khyven, for once in his life, did not argue. He stood under the water in his black shirt and his syndicate face, and for the first 30 seconds nothing about him moved. Then his legs went slightly unsteady. Just slightly. Soren was at his side before he tilted. One hand gripping Khyven's arm, the other braced against the tile wall. The water hit them both. Neither of them acknowledged it. Khyven's head dropped forward, and then, slowly, without asking, his forehead came to rest against Soren's shoulder. That was it. That was the whole moment. No words, no declaration, just the weight of a man who had never leaned on anything allowing himself to be held up. Soren felt something happen in his chest that he would spend the next 5 years trying to name. It wasn't love at first sight. It was worse than that. It was the moment he understood that whatever this was, he had already chosen it. Before being asked. Before being given the option to weigh the cost. He chose Khyven Rourke before Khyven ever chose him. That matters. Hold that. They stayed in that bathroom for 19 minutes. When Khyven's steadiness returned and he finally straightened up, he didn't look at Soren directly. He pressed one hand to the tile, breathed, then said in that low, controlled voice, not quite back to normal but trying to be, "Are you injured?" Not a question. A check. Soren shook his head. Khyven nodded once, pushed off the wall, moved to leave, and at the door he stopped, didn't turn fully, and said the thing that Soren would replay in quiet rooms for years afterward. "That was a risk you didn't have to take." Soren didn't answer, because the answer was, "I know." And neither of them was ready for that. 3 hours later, the estate shook. The explosion came from the west garden wall. Structural. Targeted. Loud enough to knock pictures off the hallway walls and send every person in the building running in the wrong direction. Soren ran toward it. Not away. Toward. Because Ezra had been in the garden. The boy was under the stone garden table when Soren found him. Curled. Eyes open. Not screaming past anything that had a name. Soren threw himself over Ezra's body 3 seconds before the secondary collapse. A section of the ornamental wall caving inward at the edge of the garden. The impact hit Soren across the shoulders, knocked the air from his lungs, and did something to his throat that he would not understand the full extent of until 2 days later in a hospital room when the doctor told him what words like vocal cord trauma and stress-induced muteness actually meant in practice. He never screamed. He stayed down. He kept his body over Ezra's until the shaking stopped. That part was easy. What came after was not. Khyven arrived in the garden 40 seconds after the collapse. Soren knew this because he had counted. That is what your brain does when everything else stops working, it counts things. He heard Khyven's voice before he saw him. Heard the edge in it that most people mistook for coldness but was actually something closer to terror moving through a filter of absolute control. Soren. Just the name. Quiet. Immediate. He found them both in the rubble and he got Ezra out first. Which was the right call, which was exactly what Soren would have told him to do. Then he pulled Soren to his feet, hands gripping both shoulders, and looked at his face with an expression Soren had never seen on him before. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then Khyven's face closed. And that was the beginning of the problem. Within 48 hours of the hospital discharge, Soren had 2 guards assigned to him. Full-time. Not visible the way bodyguards are in movies, but present. Outside every room he entered. Notified of his schedule before he had finalized it himself. He found out about the second one by accident, when a door to the estate's side library was locked from outside while he was in it, and when he knocked to be let out, the face on the other side was not Marceline's. He asked Khyven about it that evening. Khyven looked at him across the dinner table and said, "It's a precaution, until the threat is identified. Calm. Reasonable. Settled." Soren nodded. A week later, he was asked not to attend the coalition meeting he'd been scheduled for. Not commanded. Asked. By Marceline on Khyven's behalf in the kind of polite language that means the question was not actually a question. Then his access to the East Communications Room was quietly revoked. Then his scheduled departure date, originally 2 weeks post-incident, was pushed, and pushed again, without discussion, without the pretense of discussion. He started to feel it somewhere around the 3rd week. Not dramatically, the way you feel a room getting smaller, slowly, without announcement. He understood what Khyven believed he was doing. He understood the logic. There had been an attack, there was a mute child in the East Wing healing from trauma, and the person who had put his body over that child was someone Khyven wanted kept in a container where nothing could reach him. Protection without permission is still a cage. Even if the cage is gold. Even if the person who built it loves you. That part matters. Soren stopped eating dinner in the main hall around day 20. Started taking his meals in his suite. Not as protest, just because the table felt smaller than it used to, and the silence across it felt like a different kind of language he hadn't agreed to speak. Khyven noticed. Said nothing. The night Soren made his decision, there was a rainstorm. He remembered that clearly because the sound of rain against the estate windows was the only sound in the room while he wrote the note. He wrote it by hand, which felt important for reasons he couldn't fully explain, on a single sheet of cream paper from the guest suite desk. He kept it short. He had learned, by then, that long explanations gave people something to argue with. Short ones were harder to negotiate around. He folded the note, left it on the pillow of the bed, which felt dramatic in retrospect, but was simply the most visible surface. Put on his coat, picked up the bag he had packed over the previous 3 nights, a little each evening so the change in the room's visual weight would not register on the cameras he had located in the corner fixture. He left through the east kitchen exit. The guard rotation switched at 2 a.m. He knew that because he had been watching it for 11 days. He did not look back. He did not say goodbye out loud. He couldn't. His voice was still broken from the garden. What the note said, Khyven would not show anyone. Not then. Not ever. But 3 weeks later, when Marceline found it still folded on the nightstand, still on the pillow untouched, she understood something that no one in the estate had said directly. Khyven had never gone into that room. He had never read it, which meant either he didn't know how to, or he already did. Soren did not run. Running looks like fear. What he did was quieter than that. He relocated to a mid-sized city 4 hours from the estate, close enough that it wasn't symbolic, far enough that proximity wouldn't become an excuse. He rented a second-floor apartment above a print shop. The neighborhood was unremarkable. That was intentional. Unremarkable neighborhoods don't attract attention, and attention was the one thing he had enough experience to understand he could not afford. He found a position with a non-profit trauma center within 6 weeks. Pediatric focus. Nonverbal communication specialist. His voice recovered, mostly. A roughness stayed that the doctors told him might be permanent. It made him sound, one colleague said once with no malice at all, like someone who had lived more than they were letting on. She was not wrong. He did not contact anyone from the estate. Not Marceline, who had always been kind to him. Not the 2 syndicate staff members he genuinely liked. Certainly not Khyven. He checked the news occasionally. Not searching. Just keeping a distance he could see. It was in the news, 8 months after he left, that Aldrich Rourke died. Khyven's father. Quietly. In the estate. No public funeral. A single brief statement from the Rourke coalition that said nothing and communicated everything. Soren sat with that for a long time. He knew what Aldrich had meant to Khyven. Which is to say, he knew the complicated version. The version where a father can simultaneously shape everything about you and damage everything you might have become. Where grief for a person and grief for what that person never gave you can arrive at the same time in the same chest and sit there without resolving. He did not reach out. He wanted to. He didn't. What Soren couldn't see from his distance, what he wouldn't learn until much later, was what the death had cost. Khyven became sole alpha king of the Rourke syndicate overnight. No transition period. No gradual handoff. His 2 brothers stepped back by choice. They had always been the type who preferred the edges of power to the center of it. That left Khyven standing alone in a position designed for 3 people, in a coalition that was watching to see if grief would crack him open. Didn't. Of course it didn't. But something else happened, slower, less visible. The quality of his aloneness changed. Soren would not have had the language for this at the time. He found it later in a research paper on attachment patterns in high-control personalities, a line that stopped him mid-paragraph. Power amplifies loneliness if you never learn to share it. He read that line twice. Then he closed the document and went back to work. His life in the city was not small. That is worth saying. He had a routine he liked. Mornings he walked. Evenings he cooked. Nothing elaborate, the kind of cooking that is more habit than performance. He had 2 colleagues he trusted. He had a plant on the windowsill that had outlived every prediction he'd made about it. He was not waiting. He was not preserved. He was actually genuinely living. That matters. Because what happens next is not the story of a man who had been standing still. It's the story of a man who had built something real, and then received a phone call that asked him to carry it back into a place where everything had once fallen apart. The call came on a Thursday, early morning, unknown number, but the area code was familiar. He almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was not Khyven's. It was Marceline, and she said 3 sentences that stopped everything. Ezra is regressing badly. The therapists we've tried aren't reaching him. He's been asking for you by name, or rather, he's been signing it. Soren stood at his kitchen window for a long time after she finished. He looked at the plant on the sill. Ezra had not been signing when Soren left. He had not been signing at all, which meant in 4 years, this child had learned an entire language, and the first name he had chosen to write into it was Soren's. He said yes before he fully understood why, which was, he would later think exactly how some decisions have to be made. He arrived at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. No announcement, no ceremony, just the familiar weight of the estate's front gate pressing open and the gravel drive doing what it always had, crunching under tires in that specific way that told you exactly how old the stones were. Marceline met him at the door. She looked the same, older in the way that dignified people get older, sharper, not softer. She took his bag before he could argue, said welcome back in a tone that managed to be both warm and carefully neutral, and walked him straight to the east wing without passing through the main hall. He noticed the route. Intentional. Someone had planned it. He said nothing. Ezra's session was scheduled for 10. Soren spent the 20 minutes before it sitting in the small consultation room adjacent to the boys' suite, reading through the case notes the previous therapists had left. 3 of them over 4 years. The notes were thorough. They were also, he could see clearly, notes written by people who had been approaching this child like a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be sat with. There was a difference. Not everyone knew that yet. At exactly 10, he walked in. Ezra was sitting cross-legged in the center of his bed, in a blue sweatshirt 3 sizes too large, watching the door with the focused patience of a child who has learned to wait for things that may or may not arrive. When he saw Soren, his face did something complicated. Not joy exactly, more like confirmation, like he had been right about something and was allowing himself to know it. Soren sat in the chair. Signed, "Good morning." Ezra signed back immediately, both hands quick and clean. "You came back." Soren signed, "I came back." "Ezra, you're going to stay?" Soren, and this was the honest answer, the only one he could give, signed, "I'm going to be here as long as you need me." The boy looked at him for a beat, then nodded once like that settled something, then reached for the small drawing pad on his nightstand and started a sketch, like Soren had simply always been there. Session to session, over the following days, the work was quiet. No dramatic breakthroughs. No movie moment releases of grief. Just the steady, patient building of something that had no name yet but was recognizable to anyone who had spent time with traumatized children. The particular quality of safety that comes from being met without expectation, again and again, until the nervous system starts to believe it. Soren barely crossed paths with Khyven in the first 3 days. He didn't go looking. He also didn't go avoiding. That takes energy he had decided not to spend. On the 4th morning, he was crossing the main corridor with Ezra's session binder under his arm when he turned a corner and they were in the same hallway. 10 feet, maybe 12. Neither of them stopped walking immediately. Then both of them did. Khyven looked different. That was the first thing. Not older exactly, though they both were. It was more in the way he held himself. Something that used to read as strategic containment now read as something more tired. Like the architecture of control was still there, but the person maintaining it had been at it a long time without rest. He said 2 words. "You're here." Not a question. Not an accusation. Not even a greeting exactly. Just a fact. Being said out loud. Like saying it made it more real. Soren nodded. Said nothing because there was nothing yet that needed to be said. Khyven's eyes moved, just for a second, to the binder under Soren's arm. Then back up. "How is he?" "He's working," Soren said. His voice still carried that roughness. He saw Khyven hear it, saw something flicker in his expression and then be put away. "Good," Khyven said. That was the whole conversation. 2 sentences. And then Khyven walked past. Not quickly, not coldly. just with the particular deliberateness of a man who does not trust himself to stay longer than he should. Soren watched him go, and understood something new. The version of Kaivan that had locked doors and posted guards and arranged the world around Soren without asking, that version had believed, on some level, that the control itself was invisible. That if the management was careful enough, Soren wouldn't notice the shape of the cage. But this version knew that Soren had noticed, and was not pretending otherwise. That was different. Soren wasn't sure yet if it was enough, but different was somewhere to start. He spent the rest of the morning with Ezra, and the afternoon reviewing session notes, and the evening eating alone in the East dining room with a book he wasn't really reading. At 8:45, Marceline came to let him know the West Wing guest suite had a warm room and a standing dinner invitation if he wanted it. He thanked her, declined. That night he stood at his window and watched the lights in the main wing for longer than made sense. One room on the second floor stayed lit until well past midnight. He knew which room. The next morning he was in the East Corridor at 5:49 when he heard the shower cut on behind the closed door at the end of the hall. 5:45 had become 5:49, for minutes later than it used to be. He stood there and thought about that. About routine that shifts when something disrupts the person maintaining it. About what 4 minutes costs a man like Kaivan Rourke. Then Ezra appeared in the doorway of room 114 in his oversized sweatshirt and signed, with complete calm and zero context. He watched you walk in yesterday, from the second floor window. He stayed there a long time. Soren looked at the boy, then down the hall, then back at the boy. Ezra tilted his head slightly, the way children do when they already know the answer and are just waiting for the adult to catch up. And Soren felt something he hadn't expected. Not longing, not softness. Something quieter, harder to dismiss. He wasn't sure what Kaivan wanted, but Kaivan was watching him work. Watching how he moved through the estate, without guards, without orders, without permission from anyone. Watching the choices Soren made. And for the first time since he walked back through that gate, Kaivan looked unsettled. Not in the way of a man losing control. In the way of a man realizing slowly, with no good exit, that the thing he thought he had understood about Soren Devereaux, he had never understood at all. The pipes gave out at 10 past 11. No warning. No slow drip that built toward something. Just gone. A clunking sound from inside the East Wing guest suite wall, followed by a complete absence of pressure from the shower head. And then the particular silence of a system that had decided it was done for the evening. Soren stood there for a moment with the water not running. Then he dried off, dressed, and stood at the center of his room with his options arranged in front of him like a problem he had not signed up for tonight. He could call Marceline. She would fix it by morning. She was efficient that way. But morning meant sleeping without a shower after a session with Ezra that had gone 3 hours longer than planned. The boy had finally, carefully started signing about the explosion. Not the details. The feeling. What it felt like to hear something that loud. Soren had stayed very still through the entire thing and had held it together inside the session. He needed the water. That was just honest. There were 2 other functioning guest suites in the East Wing. He knew this because Marceline had mentioned it during the orientation walkthrough. Both were prepared but unoccupied. The master suite was at the end of the main corridor. Second floor. West Wing. He should have gone to one of the guest suites. He knew that. He went to the master suite anyway. The walk took 90 seconds. He counted. He knocked twice. Firm. Not hesitant, he was past performing hesitation but not aggressive either. Just the knock of a person with a reasonable request and the awareness that they were standing outside a door they had not stood in front of for 5 years. Kaivan answered in 30 seconds. Dark shirt. No jacket. Hair not fully settled. He had been awake clearly but not moving around. The kind of stillness that meant he had been sitting in one place for a long time thinking. He looked at Soren. Then at the hallway. Then back. My pipes went out, Soren said. A pause. Not long. Kaivan stepped aside. The master suite was the same and completely different. Same layout, same warm tile floors. Same amber light from the fixture above the vanity. Different in the way a room feels when the person who lives in it has been alone in it for a long time. Quieter. More deliberate. Every object in its exact place in a way that spoke less of order and more of control maintained through routine. Steam was already moving under the bathroom door. Khyven kept his shower running at night sometimes. Soren had known this. Another piece of information he had stored without meaning to, from years of knowing this man's rhythms better than his own. Khyven opened the bathroom door and the steam came out slow, the way it always had in this room. Thick and warm and carrying that cedar and warmth scent that had no reasonable explanation for still doing what it did to Soren's nervous system after 5 years and 200 miles of distance. "Shower with me." Khyven said it quietly. Not a command. Nothing like a command. More like something he had been holding for a long time and finally decided to set down in the open air and see what happened to it. Soren went still. Not in a bad way. In the way you go still when something lands closer to the truth than you were ready for. He thought about walking back out. He thought about it for 1 full second. Then he walked into the bathroom. The steam was heavier than the east wing. The shower was already running, the same shower. The same tiles. The exact room where 5 years ago Soren had braced himself against the wall and held a poisoned man upright because his body had decided to before he'd thought it through. Memory doesn't stay in your mind. It stays in your bones. And walking into that room, Soren felt it in his bones. Khyven reached for the hem of his shirt, pulled it over his head, set it on the counter. That was it. That was all. But it landed like a declaration. Because Khyven Rourke did not remove armor casually. He did not expose skin in front of people as a reflex. Every gesture he made was chosen. And he had chosen this. Soren looked at him. At the tattoo on his collarbone. The Rourke Syndicate Mark III interlocking lines that Soren had memorized once without meaning to. At the scar across his left ribs that hadn't been there 5 years ago. At the particular set of his shoulders that was not relaxed but was trying to be. The water ran. Steam filled the space between them. Then Khyven said, low, without looking away, the thing Soren had not expected. "I thought loving you meant deciding for you." Silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight. Soren stood there with that sentence in the air between them. He understood what it cost a man like Khyven to say something like that. Not because it was eloquent, because it was true. And Khyven had spent his entire life in a world where the truth was a liability. The steam thickened. Soren reached for his own shirt. Slow. And then, before either of them moved another inch, his hands came up. And he signed something. Khyven watched his hands. His expression shifted. Something crossed his face that Soren had never seen there before. Not confusion. Recognition, followed immediately by something that looked, for just a moment, in all that steam and amber light, like the beginning of being undone. The sign hung in the air for 3 full seconds. For words. Clean. Precise. No room for misreading. "You never asked me to stay." Khyven read it. And something happened in the room that was not anger and not grief and not guilt exactly. It was all of those things arriving at the same time through the same door, and the door was not wide enough for that much at once. He didn't speak immediately. This is important. A lesser man would have defended himself right away, would have listed the reasons. The guards, the threat assessment, the open attack on the estate that had nearly killed his nephew. Would have said, "Everything I did was because I was afraid of losing you," which would have been true. And still would have missed the point entirely. Khyven sat on the edge of the counter, hands flat on his thighs, head dropped, and he said nothing for a long time. Soren waited. He was good at waiting. He had built a whole career around it. Waiting is not passive. It is the hardest kind of presence. When Khyven finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, more careful. "My father ran the syndicate the same way." Not an excuse. A confession. There was a difference, and Soren heard it. He never asked anyone what they wanted. He decided, and everyone else adjusted. And it worked for the syndicate. for the coalition, for everything that needed to function and produce results. A pause. He ran his family the same way. Soren didn't move. He thought asking was weakness. He thought if you loved someone, you decided for them because you could see what they could not see. Because you had more information, more control, more ability to manage outcomes. He stopped, pressed his hands harder against his thighs. I was wrong. 3 words. That's all. But from this man, in this room, with this history between them, 3 words was not small. It was enormous. Soren signed slowly. Not fast, the way he signed when he was certain. Slow, the way he signed when what he needed to say deserved its space. You didn't just make decisions for me. You stopped seeing me as a person who could make them. Khyven received that. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He looked at Soren's hands and then at his face, and he held what had just been said without putting it down. That was different too. The Khyven from 5 years ago would have reorganized the conversation, redirected it toward something manageable. This one sat inside the discomfort and stayed there. Growth is not always loud. Sometimes it looks exactly like this. A man sitting on a counter in Steam, not running. When did you learn to sign? It was the question Soren had been waiting for. Because it was the question that mattered. After the bombing, Soren said, his voice still rough at the edges. When I understood that I might not always have my voice, and that Ezra might never have his. Khyven looked at him steadily. You learned a whole language. For him. For both of us. Another silence. Different kind this time. Not heavy. Just full. Then, from the doorway, a sound. Small feet on hardwood. They both turned. Ezra stood in the bathroom doorway in his blue sweatshirt, holding his drawing pad with both hands, blinking at the two of them in the steam like he had walked into something he expected, but had not fully planned for. He looked at Khyven, then at Soren, then at Khyven again. Then he signed, with complete composure and absolutely zero reading of the room. I had a bad dream. Are you two fighting? Because last time I had a bad dream you were both in different buildings. A beat. Then he signed one more thing directly at Soren, in the particular tone that children deploy when they have decided something without asking permission. You're not leaving again, are you? The steam ran. The water ran. And Khyven and Soren stood on opposite sides of a bathroom in this enormous estate. The same estate where everything had broken. The same room where something had first begun. And neither one of them answered immediately. Because the answer was complicated. Because the answer involved more than one person's choice. And Ezra was watching both of them, patient, certain, already knowing what he wanted the answer to be. Khyven moved first. He crossed the bathroom, stepped past Soren, and crouched in front of Ezra. Not standing over him, not handling the situation from a height. Down on one knee, eye level, in the doorway with the steam curling past both of them. Ezra watched his uncle with that particular stillness he had. The kind that came not from fear but from a child who had learned to read people very carefully because the world had stopped being predictable without warning. Khyven signed. Slow. Imperfect, he was still learning, Soren could tell, the movement slightly studied where Ezra's was natural. But real. Intentional. He stays because he wants to. Not because I ask him. Not because I tell him. Because he chooses it. Ezra looked at the signs, then looked at Soren, and Soren understood. In that moment, watching this man kneel on a bathroom floor and sign imperfect words to a traumatized child, that something had shifted in the architecture of who Khyven Rourke was. It had not happened overnight. It had not happened because of this conversation. It had been happening quietly over years, in the particular way that damage turns into something else when a person is honest enough with themselves to stop calling it strength. Ezra nodded once. The nod of a child who has received a promise and is deciding whether to trust it. Then he signed back at Khyven, still looking at him, calm and direct. You used to scare people. Khyven didn't look away. I know. Ezra, you don't scare me. Khyven. And this cost him something visible. Something that moved across his face and was not hidden, said, I know that too. A beat. Ezra held up his drawing pad. On the top page, quick pencil lines, done at some point in the last few days that Soren hadn't known about, were 3 figures. Rough, child-rendered, but unmistakable. 2 tall figures. 1 small one between them. All of them facing the same direction. Khyven looked at it for a long moment. Then he stood, put one hand on the top of Ezra's head, briefly, gently, and said, "Go back to bed. Marceline will check on you in 20 minutes. Ezra looked satisfied with this arrangement. He turned, walked back down the hall without rushing, and disappeared into room 114. The door closed. Quiet. Soren and Khyven stood alone in the steam again. There was something Soren did not know yet. Something happening 2 floors below and across the estate that he had no visibility into. This is important, because 3 days earlier, Khyven had made a decision that had nothing to do with Soren's return and everything to do with what Soren's return had reminded him of. Dax Oleander, senior underboss, 12 years with the Rourke Coalition. The kind of man who used loyalty as a tool and aggression as a language and had never in 12 years been asked to consider that there were people in the estate who were not operational assets. He had been the one, 5 years ago, who had pushed for Soren's access to be restricted. Not Khyven's idea. Khyven had heard it and agreed, which was its own kind of failure. 3 days ago, Khyven had restructured Dax Oleander out of every committee that touched the estate's personal operations. No confrontation, no announcement. The man's access simply changed. His role simply narrowed. And within 48 hours, 2 other senior staff had quietly restructured their own operating agreements. Consent-based language, opt-in clearance levels, a new internal protocol for how people moved through the estate's personal spaces. Justice in a syndicate does not always look like justice. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like a man quietly removing the architecture that made the wrong thing easy. Soren didn't know any of this yet. He would learn it later from Marceline over coffee in the East Kitchen, mentioned almost in passing the way Marceline mentioned everything important. When he heard it, he would sit with it for a long time before saying anything. But that was later. Right now, in the steam, Khyven turned to look at him and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him for longer than this evening. If I change, will you see me differently? Not, will you come back? Not, will you stay? Not, do you forgive me? Will you see me differently? Soren looked at this man who had knelt on a bathroom floor for a child, who had learned imperfect sign language in secret, who had restructured an entire power dynamic without announcing it, and understood that the question was not really about Soren's perception. It was about whether change was visible, whether the work a person does in private, the quiet dismantling of the patterns they were handed, can be seen by the people who knew the before, whether becoming someone different means anything if the people who matter most still see who you were. Soren held the question, didn't answer immediately, because this one deserved more than fast. He answered in the morning. Not that night. That night, Soren used the master suite shower, dressed, and walked back to the East Wing without resolution, which felt incomplete but was actually the most honest thing he could have done. He did not have the answer yet. He was not going to perform one. The answer came at breakfast, not as a declaration, as a fact of what happened when they were in the same room. Khyven came into the East Kitchen at 7:12. Soren was already there, making coffee, back to the door. He heard the footsteps and didn't turn. Khyven didn't announce himself. He simply moved to the other side of the kitchen and started on eggs. Like it was a morning in a life where this was normal. Like they had done this before. Like this was already something that existed. And Soren realized, standing there with the coffee running, that he had turned around. Without deciding to. Without thinking about it. He had just turned toward Khyven the way you turn toward warmth. He answered the question right then. Not out loud. Just to himself. Yes, I already see you differently. That's the problem. And the beginning. But Soren was not a man who let warmth substitute for clarity. He had been through too much for that. And when Ezra came in at 7:30, climbed onto the counter stool, and signed good morning to both of them with the casual ease of a child who had already decided this was his family. Soren set down his mug, turned to face Khyven directly, and said the thing that needed to be said out loud, in front of Ezra. On purpose. If you control me again, I will leave. Flat. Clear. No heat in it. Not a threat, a fact. The same tone he used with his most difficult clients. The tone of a person who had already decided what they were willing to accept and was simply stating it. Ezra looked up from his cereal. Looked at Khyven. Khyven set down the spatula. Looked at Soren. And nodded. Not a performance of agreement. The nod of someone who had been waiting for this exact sentence and was relieved to finally hear it. Because boundaries are not walls. They are instructions. And some people desperately need to be told exactly what the line is. Not because they are careless, but because no one in their life ever drew one and held it. Aldrich Rourke had never drawn one. He had simply moved until he hit resistance. And if there was no resistance, he moved further. Khyven had learned that pattern in his bones. And he had spent years not recognizing it in himself because it had never been named. Now it was named. Now the line was drawn. And the man on the other side of the kitchen was nodding. The next 2 weeks were not a reunion. That is the honest version. They were shared mornings and separate evenings. Co-parenting moments with Ezra. Picking up the slack for each other without comment when the other was occupied. Soren running a session while Khyven handled a coalition call. Khyven sitting with Ezra through a nightmare while Soren slept. Quiet laughter over terrible coffee one afternoon when Ezra drew a portrait of Marceline with horns and left it on the kitchen counter. A walk around the estate grounds one evening, side by side, saying nothing for 20 minutes and being entirely fine with that. Not romance. Something that has to come before romance can survive. The boring, essential work of two people learning to share space without one of them disappearing. One evening after Ezra was in bed, Khyven sat at the kitchen table with the drawings from Ezra's session notes, the one Soren had been keeping, and looked through them slowly. He did not comment on the clinical observations in the margins. He looked at the drawings themselves, at what the child had put on paper during the hardest sessions. When he finally looked up, his eyes were not clear. He is going to be okay, Soren said. Because of you. Because of himself. I just sat with him. Khyven held his gaze. I don't know how to love without fear, he said. Not as self-pity. As fact. The same tone Soren had used that morning in the kitchen. The tone of someone naming what is real because pretending otherwise is more exhausting than the truth. Soren looked at him across the table for a long moment, then said quietly, most people don't. Then how do you learn? Soren thought about that. About every client who had ever asked him a version of this question. About what he had learned over years was actually true. You practice. In small rooms. With people who stay long enough to let you. The table between them felt smaller than it had. The kitchen quieter. The night outside the window very dark and very still. And Khyven Rourke, Alpha King of the Rourke Coalition, the man 6 underbosses had stood up and walked away from without a word being exchanged. Looked at Soren Devereaux across a kitchen table and said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Only things left to do. Slowly. Without guarantees. The way everything worth building gets built. 3 weeks later. Same bathroom. Different morning. The steam ran the way it always had, thick, warm. Filling the room from the floor up until the mirror was completely gone and the edges of everything blurred into something softer than they actually were. Soren stood at the sink. Not showering. Just standing in it. The way you stand in something that used to mean one thing and now means something else. And you need a moment to let your body understand what your mind has already accepted. Khyven came in at 5:45. Not 5:49. 5:45. On time. Routine restored. Something settled. He stopped when he saw Soren. No surprise. They had been sharing the morning routine for 3 weeks now by gradual unspoken agreement. The way things between people who are paying attention become habit without either of them calling it that. He moved to stand beside him. Not touching. Just there. In the blurred mirror, Soren looked at both of them. At what 5 years had done to each of them and what it hadn't. At a man who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to put down the kind of control that feels like love but isn't. At himself, who had left, which was necessary, and come back, which was a choice, and was still choosing every morning, which was what made it real. Then Kaiven's hand came up. Slow. No assumption in it. No authority. His fingers hovered beside Soren's hand on the counter. Not touching. Waiting. Asking. Soren looked at the hand. Then at the mirror. Then just once, just briefly, down at his own hands. And nodded. Kaiven's fingers folded over his. Light. Steady. Not gripping. Just holding. The steam ran. The morning moved. Ezra would be up in 40 minutes. There was a session at 10. There was a coalition call at 2 that Kaiven would take from the East office with the door open now. Not because Soren asked him to, but because he had decided transparency was something he was going to practice like a skill, the way you practice any skill you were never taught. None of that was this moment. This moment was just the two of them, standing in steam, hands folded together, with nothing left to perform. Some damage doesn't heal. That's the truth that no one likes to say. Some things that break inside a person stay broken. The shape of the fracture just becomes part of the shape of the person. The scar tissue becomes load-bearing. The wound becomes something you build on, not something you cover. Ezra would carry the explosion in his body for the rest of his life. Soren would carry the roughness in his voice. Kaiven would carry the particular fear that came from learning control before he learned care, and having to unlearn one while the world watched. None of that was fixed. None of it was erased. But there is a thing that happens, slowly, without announcement, when people who have broken in similar directions find each other and decide to stay in the same room long enough to understand what they are now. Not what they were. Not what they lost. What they are. Soren looked at Kaiven's reflection in the blurred mirror. And for the first time in 5 years, he was not managing the distance between them. He was just standing in the same room, present, choosing. Some damage doesn't heal, transforms. And if this story moved something in you, if you've ever had to leave something you loved because staying was costing you who you were, drop a comment below. Tell me what transformation looked like for you. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We tell stories here that don't look away. Stories about love, control, damage, and the quiet courage it takes to become someone different. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And if this one reached you, share it. Pass it to someone who needs to hear that broken doesn't mean finished. See you in the next one.